So we're going to talk today about PRINCE2 and artificial intelligence. So I just spoke to somebody this morning and he said, surely those two things don't go in the same sentence, which I thought was quite comical. So what we're going to do is run you through the latest update to the PRINCE2 guide and the book. And then Andy's going to sort of link that back to artificial intelligence and why it's important. So Andy's going to give a presentation for us today on his findings. Now, so he's been the lead author for the PRINCE2 report, so he's going to take us through that, and then we can have a bit of a chat, and then we'll go to Q&A. So in terms of this session, just an introduction to Andy. If you've not sort of met Andy before, he is the exec director at the Major Projects Association. And most importantly as well, he's been around PRINCE2 for way over a decade, and is a ninja on it. And I speak to a lot of people in my life on various different things, and Andy's got the best grasp of practices and principles associated with project delivery than anyone I've ever met. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you today. So thank you, Andy, and I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to share a few slides just to help us have this conversation. So hopefully you'll see these in a moment. So Martin, can you give us a nod if you're seeing my screen in presenter mode?
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yep. Excellent. So I'm just going to run through in terms of PRINCE2, the 7th edition, and how it's sort of AI ready, and how we've incorporated AI, digital and data analytics into the method. Before I do that, I'm not going to assume that everyone on the call is a PRINCE2 practitioner or PRINCE2 certified in any way. So I'm going to provide a very quick reminder as to what's in PRINCE2, very quick, and also perhaps just some of the key changes in the 7th edition. So in terms of what PRINCE2 is, it's a method to start off with. So it's not a body of knowledge. It's it's not something that covers all aspects of project management. It's a method, and it's designed for a group of people or organizations to come together and work on a single project. It's been designed so that it is flexible and it can be applied to any type of project. So we regard that's sort of the universality philosophy of the method, and that's in sort of any culture, any place in the world. And so that's always been the design brief for the method. It is structured in terms of it provides a process model, it has a set of practices, or what we used to call themes, and it needs to be used in a whole for the method to make sense. So that's the design brief. And just to fill you in terms of its structure, there's 5 elements of PRINCE2. We call these the 5 integrated elements. It's bounded, or it's anchored, it's probably a better term, by the project context. So when I said that PRINCE2 can be applied to any type of project, what that really means is any project in its context. And the context is really important, because if you're doing a project in, say, a not-for-profit, that's likely to have different needs and approaches required than, say, a project for a private sector for-profit organisation. Likewise, a project that's entirely self-contained within one organisation will be set up and delivered differently to a project where there may be a commercial relationship between the client and the supplier providing some or all of the project work. So that context is really important. And we also have principles, and the principles are sort of what we call the guiding obligations for those applying the method to the project. There are 7 principles, and if you're applying the principles, then you are using PRINCE2. And so the principles include things like business justification. So projects need to be justified in order to start and also continue. There's principles around having defined roles and responsibilities, and also the relationships between the people involved on the organisations, rather, on the project. So this gives you a flavour of some of the principles. There's 7 practices, and they range from practices such as risk management, to how we do the plans for the project, to how we organise, and how we do things like progress and manage issues. So there's 7 of those as well. And there are 7 processes that take you through the life cycle of the project, from the first process of starting up a project all the way through to the closing a project process. And as you can see in the diagram on the screen now, at the centre of the method is that projects are delivered by people, for people, and involve people. So the people are at the heart of the method. And this is a change to the 7th edition of PRINCE2. Although PRINCE2 has always had defined roles and responsibilities, and has always included, the critical activities associated with stakeholder engagement and communications and so on, we didn't include in previous editions things like leadership and management, because we felt that that was sort of very heavily influenced by organisational culture or geographical culture as well. And one thing that might work in one organisation may not necessarily work in another. But for the 7th edition, we've tackled that head on. We've placed people at the heart, and we describe the sort of the project ecosystem and the organisational ecosystem, and importantly, understanding and responding to the relationships of all those involved in the project. And critically, it also covers not just those involved in the project, but those impacted by the project, so both inside and outside. That's all I'm going to cover in terms of a recap of PRINCE2. If you're not PRINCE2 qualified, there's a vast army of training providers that can help you, both running sort of virtual online training and classroom training, and there's a wealth of supporting materials on the My Axelos website as well. So it's not an onerous task to learn the method, get up to speed, and get certified. So let's move on then to AI and data analytics. And as I've just done with PRINCE2, I'm going to do a little recap first, and then discuss how AI and data analytics is incorporated in PRINCE2. So some people may have seen me give sort of this element of a talk before, but I really want to take it back to thinking about data analytics. And I worked in retail projects fairly early in my career, and I was involved in the gold rush of rolling out loyalty cards. Tesco was the first, so the Tesco Club Card was launched in 1995 by a husband and wife team. Took the pitch to Tesco, his company called dunnhumby, and actually the Club Card project only cost Tesco £250,000, and it propelled them from I think 3rd or 4th in the ranking of UK supermarkets to the #1 spot. They increased their sales by 18% in 1 year. Now, as I said, I worked in retail in that time, and any retailer that sort of had an increase in sales of 1%, 2%, or 3% was doing really well. So to get an 18% jump in a year was just never heard of before in that sector. Now, what was really interesting with the Club Card as a case study, you can Google it. There's lots of information on LinkedIn and sort of historical sort of MBA articles and so on, is that most of the other retailers thought it was about loyalty. And it was like the airlines had loyalty schemes at the time to keep you coming back and back. It was not about loyalty. It was about micro marketing. They knew, by sort of exit polls and other things, the sort of people that came through their store, but they didn't really know much about the people that were spending things or buying things rather than spending money in their stores. But by linking their Club Card with their purchases, and then also having other information about people in terms of where they lived and the sort of demographics of their area and likely occupation and so on, they were able to start to do some micro marketing. It also helped them with merchandising, because through that data analytics, they found out things like, for example, how many facings of tins of beans would yield the maximum sale of beans in a given week. Not only that, whether if it was at eye level or floor level or different aisles. So they got lots of data insights that enabled them to optimize their store, but also the micro marketing. And just coming on to the micro marketing, that was things like the vouchers that you received. They weren't vouchers they were sending to everyone. Those vouchers were unique to you based upon what you had previously bought. So it was nudging you to increase your basket size each time you came into the store. So that was 1994, 30 years ago from where we're now heading, and it transformed, the performance of one organization and then was replicated by many others in that sector. So I've also plucked another sector to see how AI and data analytics is changing that. And something as thuggish as football or soccer, if you're not from the UK, has been changed. But again, it's not new. The first use of data in football actually came from the 1930s. Wing Commander Reap developed a system of annotating events in football, and he actually had a roll of paper that he used to roll up and minute by minute through the game, and he would mark things like when the ball went out, when it had a throw in, when there was a corner, when there was a shot at goal, and so on. And through that analysis, he published, or he sort of went over them time and time again, and he published his findings. It wasn't until 1968 the FA got hold of it, and then they sort of did some further guidance, sent out a technical manual, their first technical manual that went out to managers. And one thing that they picked up on was that Wing Commander Reap identified that for every pass after 3 passes, it reduced your chances of scoring a goal. So the FA's recommendation is that you need to get the ball in the opponent's penalty box, ideally in 2 or 3 passes. Now, that developed the English football's approach to what we now call kick and rush, or route one. The rest of continental Europe played a possession-based game because their evidence was telling them something different. And it's since then we have learned that actually trying to shoot on your 3rd or 4th pass of the ball is likely to give the possession away, and you're more likely to concede a goal as well. So there's sort of other factors there that they've since learned, that you can misinterpret data and end up with the wrong result. But interestingly, on that previous slide, you saw there's Moneyball. So in baseball, in the 1990s, the Oakland A's had the lowest budget in their league, and they turned to data analytics and become very formulaic in how they recruited people into the team and then how they set out to play. That was copied in the UK by Bolton, Sam Allardyce, and he identified there were 3 factors that would certainly ensure that Bolton wouldn't get relegated, and that was the team that had the average fastest speed of their players or their squad, and also covered the most distance, were least likely to lose, and also that the best chance of scoring would come from set pieces. So there were 2 things that they set out for Bolton, and they stayed in the Premier League on one of the lowest budgets for year after year after year under Sam's watch. In 2010, the Opta, who collect data, they have 32 million data items. This was back in 2010 from 12,000 matches, and they developed something called expected goals, which is the likelihood of scoring from any position on the pitch, depending upon where the other players are on the pitch as well. And one of their conclusions is that if you shoot from outside the box, you only have a 1 in 40 chance of scoring a goal. But the majority of shots on goal at the time were from outside the box. So when they published that finding, in the year that followed, there was something like only 10% of the shots were from outside the box. So they completely changed how football was played by publishing some insight from some data analytics that they shared with the Premier League and other leagues. And you can see now, since 2010, if we looked back at matches then the way that the game is played is completely different. The way players train is completely different. The diets they have is completely different. The way that teams recruit players is completely different, and it's very data driven now compared to the sort of intuition driven that was back in 2010 or before the expected goals one. And then the other challenge we've got is if we now compare project management as what I call the game of project management, if we're thinking about the game of football. Now, the game of project management hasn't really changed in the sort of same time frame. If I go back, 20, 30, 40 years, we can think of some things that have come in. So risk management didn't really exist in its current form 30 or 40 years ago. Then we've had things like Agile, which came in just over 20 years ago. Benefits management in the way we do it today is a bit different from, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But if we were to go back and look at some project documentation from 10, 20, 30 or 40 years ago, as project professionals, we would recognize it. It would not look much different from what we produce today. But we also know that project performance over that period hasn't significantly improved. We could argue that projects have become more complex over that time frame, but performance isn't keeping up with the complexity or with the practice that we have developed. So we do need a new approach, and my argument is that we should be taking a data-driven approach. And if we think about project management as an experiment, because it must be an experiment, otherwise we would know exactly how to do it and get the right outcome every time, then we need to do projects under experimental conditions, which means keeping data about how we did it, all the context, so that we can learn from it. So that's my sort of recap on first of all, PRINCE2, what is it, and the world of AI and data and how it could apply to projects. So what I'd like to do now is just to explain what's in the 7th edition and how it's set up to be AI ready. Now, in the first instance, we do sort of link and describe AI within a broader family of concepts, and that's within sort of the digital and data aspect. And we recognise that it will transform how we manage projects, and that can be one of two ways. So either it will be how we go about managing the project, and the other one is about how we go about delivering the specialist work. Now, as PRINCE2 is a universal method that could be applied to an IT project or a construction project or business change, transformation, regeneration, all sorts of projects, marketing and so on, then we don't describe how specialist work is done, but we expect that's where there will be lots of applications of particularly digital and data analytics being applied around the efficiency and effectiveness of specialist work. But the way that PRINCE2 is AI ready is it expects that all projects will have a digital and data management approach for the project. Now that's set up at the beginning, and then it's refined as you go through the development before you then get agreement to proceed, and it should be reviewed and updated throughout the project in the same way that you would review and update other management approaches such as risk management or stakeholder engagement. So it's not something that's just bolted on, it's something that's considered all the way through, and it's also integrated to those 5 elements that I mentioned at the beginning. So there's references to the digital and data management approach in all of the practices, in the processes, in the principles, and also in the people element as well. So in terms of just unpicking both of those two things then, so the digital aspect, and the method prompts the practitioners, those who are using the method, to consider a number of things and then to set up the project once you've sort of gathered and understood and considered these things. And here's just some of those that the method is prompting project teams to think about. So, simply, what technology do you need? Are you going to use automation, and other digital technology to help with the project management activities or the specialist work? Where is it going to come from? Is it something that those organizations involved in the project already have, whether that's the business, the organization that's commissioning the project, or one or more of the suppliers to the project, or is it going to be a unique system that you're going to procure, set up, and then maintain specifically for the project? So there's a number of things we need to think about, and we know that if we consider that and set out with that in mind at the beginning, then we're going to get the systems in place when we need them, rather than chasing our tail, always trying to set up from what we needed last week rather than what we need next week, or last month rather than what we need next month, for example. And then if we think about data, again, there's a lot more than this, but some of the prompts that the method is asking us to think about is, what data or information do we need? And that's particularly around to enable us to make decisions, to enable those decisions to be transparent and the decision makers to be held to account. And also, what other information do we need for things like control or assurance, or to give confidence to those who are interested in the project? So it's sort of back to, why do we need the information and what we're going to do from it? Where's it going to come from? How we're going to hold it? How's it going to be kept secure? What sort of privacy is required if there's sensitive information, or if you're subject to GDPR or equivalent type legislation? How are you going to analyze it? What systems do you need to analyze it? Are you going to curate it? How are you going to organize it? How are you going to present it in terms of the insights that you're going to gain from it? Who has access? Who has rights? How are you going to make sure that the data's got integrity? You understand the provenance of the data and the quality of it. How are you going to assure that quality? And what happens to your data when the project finishes? A characteristic of a project is that it is temporary. And I've been long enough in the project game now to I can count far too many projects that just get rapidly closed down at the end, and all that hard-won data that would be massively valuable for this experiment of project management, it just gets lost. I mean, I've seen, it's not just in project management terms, but also project product terms. I mean, I've worked on a project where all of the drawings related to all the engineering drawings are in a shipping container in the car park, and when we opened it up, because we needed to do some enhancements and some maintenance on the asset, water had got in and all those drawings were ruined, and there was no other digital copy of those drawings. So we had to then incur huge expense to go and do surveys and condition surveys and so on, to find out what was really built and what was it like. So that's just some of the prompts, and hopefully you're getting a flavour for what's in the new method. The other thing about applying it, we sort of set out in the companion guide that Martin mentioned earlier, that's available to people that have gone through the PRINCE2 exam and subscribe to the My Axelos site, that we describe it in this spectrum. So at one end, there's sort of automation, the sort of things you've already got in sort of your Outlook. For example, you can set up automation in terms of how you receive and process your emails. Then there's sort of data analytics, and at the other end of the spectrum, we talk about generative AI, these large language models where we can use natural language to instruct or query or generate content. And underpinning that, we have digital technology where we might set up on our project the use of sensors. So, for example, the use of drones to help us with our earned value or to do site surveys, or body-worn videos, cameras, so that as people are walking around a site, they're just getting a reflection back of what the actual built position is on a project. So we describe the application of that digital and data, of the AI spectrum, in these 4 ways. And then for each of those 5 integrated elements in that companion guide, we give some examples, and this is just a few of them, around how it could be used and the sorts of things that are possible, just by applying a little bit of imagination, and also by way of reference to some case studies and examples that we've come across. So you can see here on the screen now, I've just shown an example of some of those that are in that companion guide regarding the people element of PRINCE2. So you can see that we could use it around understanding stakeholder and user perceptions to do some sense making as a part of a consultation activity. Or if you're having to consult with a large number of users or stakeholders, you might want to use automation to help you collect that data and then organize it so it can then later be analyzed. So that gives you some examples of the sorts of things that to expect across those 5 integrated elements of PRINCE2. So I'd just like to give some conclusions, and then I'll perhaps invite Martin to come back in to give some examples of some of the things that we illustrated through the companion guide. But my conclusion here is that we know that if we think about where we've come from and how that is now very, very different in terms of the power of AI. When I first started working in projects, we did have some planning tools, but we had to be very specific about how we set up those tools in terms of producing our schedules and our networks and so on. But anything that we wanted to do differently, we had to go back to the vendor, or the vendor then had to do some new development to enable us to do different things. So as you can see on that sort of first bullet there, that basically they would do a very narrow task, and if you wanted to vary from that task, it generally required the program to be changed or software to be developed. With AI, we now have the position where the software, if you like, the system learns and it can adapt based upon changing context. Now, it has to be trained to do that, but we're seeing with the various iterations, whether it's ChatGPT or Copilot and other generative AI models, that they are learning very fast. And what we don't have to do is to keep reprogramming these models. However, they are data hungry, and I'm sure we'll come on to a discussion in a moment about the access of project data and the amount of project data we need in order to train some of these models. You think about the purpose of why we want to use AI in project management. It's really about helping the humans. We still need people. People is at the heart of the method in PRINCE2, and that will be the same whether we're using AI or not. But we want to help the humans with their project management tasks. And I mentioned earlier, that's really going to focus on that decision making and also around some efficiency by automating things and helping us make or do things quicker and better than we would otherwise do on a manual basis. So ultimately, it's about helping to reduce or manage that uncertainty or ambiguity, which is typical of projects, which by their very nature are temporary and have elements of uniqueness and aren't as repeatable as business as usual or operations and functional work. I really believe that this change in terms of having something that can learn and adapt with us and can interact with us is a new era, and I think we really are only limited by our imagination at this stage. And what I would really encourage today, when people think about how you're going to use AI and data analytics on your projects, is don't make it do things that you used to do, but just quicker. So, if all you're going to use it for is to generate some templates, ask your question, yourself a question: why do you need those templates? What are they really doing for? What decisions are they helping you make? How is it helping you on your project? And think of it in that way. I do feel that going forward, some of the things we've codified into our bodies of knowledge will just be very, very different. We'll be doing a lot more dynamic management and less pre-planned management of work we need on projects. And just one reminder before I hand back to Martin, that I use this expression a lot, but I see so many cases where project decisions are being made without data. And that's not because the data was hard to get hold of. It's just because people didn't try to get hold of the data and didn't try to analyze it and didn't try to challenge the insights that had come from it. And they've ended up making poor decisions. And I would argue, if you're managing your project without data, that's not project management. That's just winging it or making it up as you go along. So Martin, back to you, and open to questions and any comments.
Absolutely superb, Andy. Thank you very much. So, we can all see why Andy's a ninja on this stuff. He's got some great depth of understanding, and probably more so than anybody else I've met. And it's brilliant. So thank you, Andy. And it was a pleasure to write that guide with you. I enjoyed it. So let's kick some stuff about then, Andy. So in terms of the guide, we go through some examples in there, some scenarios, and we bring them to life in each section through some of the stages that you talk about, etc. So in terms of the book as well, right? Is the book available to everybody? If you've done the Prince course, what's the best way for people to get hold of the book?
Yeah, so PRINCE2 is now owned by PeopleCert. So some people may recall that it was OGC, Office of Government Commerce, that originated the first Prince and did an agreement with Capita and set up Axelos to run Prince2, both the exams and the ongoing development of the content, probably about 15 or so years ago. I can't remember the exact date. And then that was then that was then fully handed over to the private sector to run, and it's now under the stewardship of PeopleCert. So the manuals can be booked through or purchased through PeopleCert. I think most people get hold of the manual through their exams and through their training providers, and people that have gone through the training can also then subscribe to the My Axelos site, which provides lots of additional materials to support practitioners, and that includes the guide that we co-authored, Martin. So that AI in practice for Prince2 practitioners sits on the My Axelos portal.
Oh, brilliant. So in terms of the guide, Andy, we've got some examples in there. There's one of them where we're talking about a city council, right? So it's a made-up scenario. We're talking about the city council. So the example is around the risk potential assessment, right? So that's something that government uses normally. So we look at the risk potential assessment to look at the level of assurance that that project needs, right? So is it a risky project? If so, then what we're going to do about it. And with that risk potential assessment, we then start to drill into it and say, what can we do in the future if we start to use project data analytics and things like artificial intelligence to start to get under the hood of some of these data-driven insights, and what does it mean for the risk potential assessment? So we then drilled into things like, there's an app, if we could fill the app in, that then starts to look across all of these different organizations and these different projects. So if we fill in the app in based around specific characteristics of that risk potential assessment, like for instance, is it the first of a type? Is it the first technology you've ever used? Is it a supplier that you've worked with before, etc.? If we can fill all of that in, it then starts to generate some of these sort of indicators for us about the level of risk in that project. So delivery risk, which then brings in the governance and the oversight. So can you help me to link that back to Prince2 then, Andy? So that's the example that we put in the guide about, it's going way beyond a form where we can move to an app. And some of that we can rip out of corporate systems as well. So the performance of a company, for instance, what's the financial performance of that company? We can go into company's house data and start to rip it out and see if that company is getting worse or getting better, etc. We can also go to things like Contracts Finder, which is a UK government site where they've awarded loads of contracts. We can pull all those contracts out and see if their workload's going up, going down. So if it's going up exceptionally fast, if they've got too much work on that they can't cope with, etc. So that then just helps to guide our assurance processes. So
yeah, I think that's a really good example because, yeah, so as I said, risk management came around in the 90s in the current form that we know it, in terms of probability impact assessments, understanding pre-mitigated risk, post-mitigated risk, and the controls that we would put in place for ongoing monitoring to see if it's the likelihood is increasing or decreasing and so on. And it's easy for us to describe that in a risk management approach and do so in a sort of generic way, and we can get our risk register, as you said, and that particular one is linking it back to perhaps contractor performance. And I bet if we did sort of a straw poll now on people on the call and said, how many of you got contractor performance as a risk on your risk register, we would get a high number of hands popping up. But when we've talked about how we're integrating data analytics into the method, what we'll be doing there is to say, okay, we've got contractor risk as something that we're concerned about, and what you're then applying is, well, how do we apply data analytics to help us with that particular risk? And the example you gave is, can we link it to to other forms of data that that might be publicly available? There might also be some company in-house data that's got on performance of different contractors in different contexts. But you then set up your data feeds to help you do that analysis, so that you can get you can set some warnings or triggers, so that you can act on things ahead of when you need them. So that's just making you sort of think it through and then set it up in that way. And again, the difference being is that it's not something that you're just covering a risk workshop and then review each end of stage, or when you're doing a checkpoint, when you're preparing a checkpoint report. It's something that you're now automating. So as a project manager, you've set it up, you've put your data feeds in place, you set your thresholds where you want to be alerted, and now you're getting some dynamic information to say, actually, contractor X has now hit these triggers, and you might want to go and do something beyond what controls you've already got in place. So I think that was a good example, and those sort of approaches are happening. So this isn't sort of made up. We're seeing this out there, but we should be seeing it everywhere rather than in isolated cases.
Brilliant. So you mentioned about templates as well, right? So let's just kick that about between us. And then once it gets to about 10 to, I'll open the floor. So Andrew, I see you've put a question in there, so you can come off mute in about 5 minutes, and we'll start to kick some of these about, right? So let's talk about the templates, Andy, right? So you see Marvin. So Marvin's a bot we've been working up. It's in the public domain. You can all use it, and I'll post the link at the end of this call. What we're trying to do with Marvin is to use it to start to populate a business case, right? So you can use it to start create sections of a business case. So it'll iterate through it. It'll give you some prompts. You say, no, that's not quite right. And then you re-prompt it, and it'll give you better and better text. You press export, and it squirts it into a Word document, and you've got a business case sorted out. But the problem with that is we start to automate the business case process. And if I was in charge and I've got 50 business cases coming in, and I want a bot which starts to assess those business cases for me and tell me which business cases to sign off and which ones to send back and to get redone or to reject those business cases. So if I'm doing that, you get a bot against a bot, right? And both of those bots are trying to outdo each other. So that would be something called an adversarial network, right? And that's the way that some of these machine learning algorithms actually work, is to try and outdo each other, and that spirals up the quality of them. But the end result of this is that, why do we need a business case anymore if you've got a bot writing it and a bot checking it off? What could we reduce it to in terms of the irreducible minimum? Will we instead turn it into a workflow? Do we then start to get inside of the assurance of some of these projects up front, and people then start to say, right, I don't trust your business case because it's now laden with bias. I want to see the evidence that underpins it. So if you're saying it's going to be done in 3 years, I've got a lot of confidence that it's going to be done in 3 years. So let's kick that about a bit, Andy. So give me your views on it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think and it's a good example, but it's a poor example, because I think if an organization's using bots to review and approve or reject business cases, they're doing far too many projects. So, you shouldn't, they're investments that you should be taking time to consider. Now, I think you can use bots to help run some assurance analysis and provide commentary on different aspects of the business case, and perhaps do some additional sensitivity analysis or whatever it might be, or just to run some comparisons to say we would expect a business case to normally be within this range for this type of project. And then that's enabling the human in the center, or the humans, to apply their judgment and to say, is it worthwhile them doing that particular project given what else is going on within their organization or within the context. So I think, the bot to help you create some of the thinking behind the business case, I think is a good idea. I think bots to help you assure parts of the business case is a good idea. I think, the bot to create all of the content and the bot to review all the content is a bad idea. So that's my thinking on that. I think as well, in terms of bots to produce what we would otherwise use from templates. The early templates were just headings, weren't they? And it was just because MS Word or other word processes were clunky in how we set up documents, and we wanted our logos on them. We wanted them to look and feel the same, and people that were doing that assurance work would want to make sure that the project proposers, if we're thinking of a business case now, are covering all the things we would want them to cover. And we might in the template include some guidance or some criteria of things we expect to see within that section. Now, as someone that's reviewed many hundreds of projects, and probably 1,000, I don't know, I have to one day go and count them all up, but within an organization, sometimes I might see 20, 30 business cases, and they all look pretty similar. And if I strip out the generic or the common content, I'm probably only left with about 15%, 20% or so content that's unique to that specific project. So I do have a fear when people use lots of templated material that we end up with what I call project wallpaper, and you're just creating too much noise, and you have to then hunt through what's the specific things for the project that I need to think about. So I would always argue for less content, not more content in things. So a 20-page business case for me is much better than a 50-page business case generally. It depends on the nature of the project, but yeah. So I would hope that in a few years' time, whether it's 10 years or 3 years, depending on how quickly we're advancing with these things, that the need to pad out our very unique aspects of the project with generic aspects will reduce, and we can just really focus what's unique for this project. And we can take as read all those other things in terms of what would we expect to see in a business case and what is the guidance and the criteria that we might use to judge it. We don't need to keep that in template because it should be covered elsewhere.
Well, so I spoke to an organisation this morning about those sort of challenges. Like today, talking about the assurance challenges, and they do all of these sort of periodic, gate assurances, they do periodic assurances. And in terms of that process, they're saying, so what can we do to optimize this, right? What can we do to throw a lot of technology at it? And if it's checklists, right, you can go through the checklist. So I've got a sort of concept of life. If you can describe it in logic, then you can code it. If it's intuition, so a bit of gut feel, if you've got enough data, you can train a machine learning model to sort of pick up those patterns that intuitively you're pulling out through instinct and intuition. So you can do both, right? You can do the logic and you can do the intuition, but the intuition is a lot harder because you need a lot of data to train the bots. So I believe personally that a lot of this assurance activity is about a logic base. So you're looking for certain things and make sure that processes are being followed. The level of rigor is appropriate. And what you're also looking at doing is to walk them through a workflow process, right? So saying, ask them some questions of that data and say, so your schedule is based upon X, Y, Z. Can you provide the reference back to that data? So it came from some norms, for instance. Is that norm a valid norm? If it is, it can be checked by the bot and you just tick it off. It's saying, yeah, I trust the way that this schedule has been constructed or this cost plan has been constructed because it's now linked back. So you can take the human out the loop of those things, move them up the value chain and say, instead of checking that these things have been done, you've now got a bot making sure that people have followed the process and it's walked them through the process in the first place. So it actually knows because it's walking you through the process that it's been done properly. So you don't need man marking going on then. You don't need somebody who's checking that you've done your job properly because it's been done at source. So that frees people up then. So instead of assuring that you've done your job properly, you can now say, let me help you to do your job better. That's where we need to be. Not, I don't trust you and you've not done your job properly. It's a different way of thinking, I think. So any thoughts on that, Andy? And then I'll open up.
Yeah, and I think, from an assurance perspective, if you think about it, it often gets applied at the end of a process, and whether that's the end of a process, and I'm using the word process there, broadly, but the end of a process to produce a document, you would then do some assurance at the end of that to check that all the things you expect to see in it and how it's been achieved, how it's been gathered and produced is appropriate. Or you'll do it at the end of a stage, or the end of, say, a procurement activity. So it's often done at the end. And I think how do we help people to do things better? You really want to be doing them through the process or as early in the process as possible rather than at the end. I think at the end you can do checking, but assurance in terms of helping people do things better is better done through the process and at the end of the process. And if you think about it, we're seeing that in other aspects of our work and life, aren't we? So, we've used this analogy in our sort of intellectual sparring, Martin, in terms of how we can think about using AI and data and analytics in projects. But the one we often come back to is the sat nav, because it has a lot of relevance to projects, because we think about how we go about routes, and routes could be like our plan that we navigate through the life of a project to deliver a specific outcome. But when you think about the sort of things we now get, is that before we set out on a journey, the sat nav will give us options, and that's helping us be a better not driver as such, but a better traveller in terms of the routes that we're going to select and whether we want to do it through speed or reliability, but it's giving us options. It might help us avoid pinch points, and in doing so we're reducing congestion in other places. So we're getting advice, aren't we? And we're being a better traveller through the advice that we're given, and that's real time. So what might be true at the beginning when we're driving off the driveway might be different half an hour later when we're on the M6 and something's happened and we go, okay, right, I need to come off now and go down the A50 instead. So we're getting that advice, and I would say that's a form of assurance too. And we need, what's the equivalent in project terms for us to do that.
Love it. So Andrew, if you want to come off mute and ask your question, welcome.
I was just wondering whether PRINCE2 might include a set of relevant metrics or standards that could be used to then drive data collection. So you could do benchmarking. Have there been any thoughts to sort of include that sort of thing in any guidance?
I think there's been lots of thoughts around that, Andrew, for many organisations for quite some time. But whether you would put that into a method, it probably doesn't feel the right place to put it, because coming back to those 5 integrated elements of PRINCE2, that top one, the project context, really does trump all the other ones in terms of what appropriate metrics are. I spent some time, as you may remember, in Transport for London, and in particular there was some work at London Underground, and they were looking to get some benchmarks or some metrics around the cost of a kilometre of track in terms of maintenance. And it was so, in terms of the things that influence that, is around possession, so how much time you get of the asset to do the work. Then there's access, so is it deep tube, is it a surface level, and so on. And then, when they were doing some benchmarking, there's for that one, there's something called Comet, which is it's basically a network of every metro around, not every, but nearly all the metros around the world. So they have lots of metrics that they can benchmark, but what they come up with there is that the context was so critical that actually the concept of an average cost per kilometre of track was a meaningless number on its own. All those contextual factors were far more critical, and I think we've got the same for lots of different projects in terms of what those benchmarks could be. Now, Martin's probably better to come in on this than I am, because Martin's worked to set up some data trusts that are very specific to certain sectors, and that's where you've got organisations who are like Comet, similar, and so it is worth their while pooling their data across organizations and within organizations to get that, what Martin earlier on was talking about, those norms. And I think that is worthwhile doing.
Yeah. So in terms of that data, and so Data Trust, we've got one for the construction sector. It's a non-profit. It's called Construction Data Limited. It's a limited company, not a trust, because trust is a protected term, right? So that's the problem with the trust. But it is a data trust where we all pull data to a set of rules, and there's access constraints with that data because some of it's sensitive, and then we can open it up. So the thing about the benchmarking data, the benchmarking is, right, I'll tell you about the price of a tunnel, right? So just like Andy said, there's loads of context for that. So is it, so in terms of the waste, can you use the waste for the banking, or are you going to take it and dispose of it, etc.? Is that contaminated waste? Is it clean waste? There's loads and loads and loads of questions. So we would call those features as part of a machine learning model. So we'd start to weight those features. So if we've got enough data, and this is part of the problem, is one organization has not got enough data. And that's why we need to pull the data so there's enough of it so we can train the models. If we train the models, we can then get predictive about some of this. So I think Andrew's off, and I've got another call as well that I need to be on. So apologies to Richard. I think he's just asked the question in there, right? So about ISO, got some concerns, etc. Somebody spoke to him.
Yeah, I can come in on that one, Martin. So
yeah, go for it.
Again, one of the things that's in the data and digital management approach is linking the project management approaches to the business management approaches. So you've got to line them back to the policies. So if your organization says thou shalt not use AI, then your digital and data management approach will be aligned to your organizational policies. If your organization says that you can use it but limited in these ways, then that will tell you how you can use it, or give you the options about how you might use it on your project. I think we also need to be careful within those sort of policy concerns, is that, I mean, we haven't defined it on this call, but we do in the book, and it is elsewhere. But what do we really mean by AI? And I suspect it's generative AI that's being banned in some uses, and particular versions of generative AI, whether that's people banning, ChatGPT or Bard or Copilot from its use. We had an interesting chat at a summit with a number of public sector organizations, and they were recognizing, and some of those in sensitive areas, and they were recognizing that they can put these bans in place, but people are using them on their home computers or on their phones, their personal phones anyway. So I think there was a discussion that we had with a part of a particular government that was saying that they're going to embrace it rather than ban it, because that's a better way of controlling what might come from it. But I think it's a really good point about those sort of ethical concerns as well.
Superb. Well, it's a great session.
Thank you, Martin. Appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
You're welcome, Richard.
So thanks a lot, Andy. I do appreciate it. And thank you to all of you as well for coming today. We are trying to sort of spread the word about the power of advanced project data analytics. So thank you so much.